Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. We had to turn the chairs around, I'm told, because the lighting is better here for the video. So apologies for any inconvenience, but those who came in last and on the back row, you know what they say, the last shall be first. First shall be last. In any case, I thank you all very much for coming. This is an extraordinarily important issue, as we have just seen yet again in Boston. Now, there's a great deal of information that's come out about what happened in Boston, and it is very important to note some of the details that should be kept in mind. One of them is that the Russian authorities notified the FBI about Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother, several times, telling him he was meeting with jihadis in Dagestan in the Caucasus, and that he was somebody they should keep an eye on. Not only that, but it has just come out also that this outlandish mother that they have, who says, Allahu Akbar, and I don't care if they kill my other son, they killed this son, and I will just say Allahu Akbar. And she says that they were framed because, of course, America wants to frame Muslims and hates Muslims and all this nonsense. She was on the terror watch list also. And Tamerlan Tsarnaev was on the terror watch list, although when the Russian authorities went to the FBI essentially did nothing. Now, the angle on this story as a massive failure of American intelligence and law enforcement, I think, has not yet even begun to unfold. And maybe it never will, because there are a lot of people in power who have a lot of reasons to shove it all under the rug. Nonetheless, enough has come out already so that we can know that it was a massive failure of law enforcement and intelligence. Now, why did it happen? Why did the FBI not keep an eye? Not only did they not keep an eye on him, they were so completely not on the case that he was able to amass the ingredients for these bombs that were made according to the specifications of the Al-Qaeda magazine Inspire, and nobody was paying any attention to this guy on the terror watch list as he gets these bomb materials. Now, I think this is the fruit of something that was set in motion several years ago. And unfortunately, part of it has to do with events in which I was actually directly involved. In 2010, I spoke to a military group in Louisville, Kentucky, and I used to give training to military and FBI and to Joint Terrorism Task Force and to various other agencies about Islam, and explain to them what it is in Islamic texts and teachings that makes people want to kill people. Because after all, it's the fundamental rule of warfare, know your enemy. And if you don't understand the motives and goals of the people who are trying to kill you, then you can't stop them. But the more you know them, the more you are able to outthink them. And so the US military and the FBI used to bring in me and many other people who work in the same field, and we would do this training. But then, in 2010, I spoke at in Louisville at this military base, and published a photo on my website, Jihad Watch, of me standing with two of the hosts, who were active US military personnel at the time. Now, I did this on purpose, because the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood front group in the United States, had already started to put pressure on the military for bringing in me and others like me to speak. And so, when I got there, the people at the base said, you can't tell anybody you were here. And I thought, wait a minute. Is this the United States? Is the US military so afraid of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood that they're going to let them dictate who they can bring in and who they can't? And I thought, you know, I just can't go along with that. It was the principle of the thing that if the US military on the front lines of protecting this nation. I mean, that's their only purpose, or what ought to be their only purpose, is kowtowing to people who are essentially on the other side, then we're in trouble. Right. And so these two officers who were among my hosts, they agreed with me, and that's why they posed for the picture and why we put the picture up. But they did ask that the insignia, their insignia, be obscured and so on. And so I did that. However, on the back wall was the logo of the place itself. And we forgot about that. And so the Council on American Islamic Relations complained, and they wrote to the military base in Louisville, they wrote to the Secretary of Defense, they wrote to the head of the FBI, they got a huge coalition, they got Reverend Jesse Jackson to complain, they got all kinds of people to complain because I was training military personnel. And they broadened it out and began a campaign to get all of the training materials that were being used by the FBI and other intelligence agencies and DHS scrubbed of any mention of Islam and jihad, and all the trainers like me be removed. And they did. In 2011, Fatima Hera, who is the head of a Muslim advocacy group in the United States, along with 57 other Muslim organizations, including these Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood groups, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Muslim American Society, the Islamic Society of North America, and others, wrote to John Brennan, who was then the Deputy National Security Advisor, and said, you've got to cleanse the training materials of all this Islamophobic material. And they specified. They said, you've got Spencer in there, and you've got Stephen Coughlin, who is a great man, who is the only authority on Islamic law in the Pentagon for many years, until he was cashiered at the behest of Hisham Islam, the assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And various other people and various other materials. They listed it all. They said, this has all got to go. It's racist. What racist? Jihad terror? I always forget. And it's bigoted and Islamophobic and hateful and so on. Okay, Brennan wrote back, I think maybe 40 or 50 seconds later, and he said, yes, we're so sorry, yes, we're going to scrub all this, we're going to undertake a massive effort. Not only are we going to scrub all this, but we're going to retrain everybody who is trained by this material, or these trainers. And we're going to make sure that there's nothing about Islam or jihad in any terror training materials. Now, look, how many non-Muslim terrorists can you really name? I keep hearing about Timothy McVeigh, and you know, eventually there's got to be an expiration date on that. It's been almost 20 years. And Timothy McVeigh represented no organized movement. There are Islamic jihadis in every continent and pretty much every nation of the world. There are armed Islamic jihads going on against non-Muslims in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Burma, in Iraq, in Chechnya, in Nigeria, in Egypt and Syria, and all over the globe. But that's the one terror threat that the deputy head of national security and now the CIA director said, we won't talk about. Okay, so along comes Tamerlan Tsarnaev. And the Russian authorities say he met with a jihad leader in Dagestan. And he met with him 6 times. And we think this guy is trouble. And they get this in the defanged, politically correct, sanitized, retrained, deprogrammed, or reprogrammed, re-educated FBI. How did they know what to look for? How did they know what the danger signs were? How did they know what on earth, how on earth they could understand what they were even seeing if they looked into this man's activities? They were forbidden to look into anything that would have made it make sense to them. They were not allowed to look into the very things that would have made it all make sense. And And so, what happened? Now, what this is a concerted effort, and it is part of a much larger effort. And the effort that we see bearing fruit in Boston, that we saw bearing fruit in Boston, and that we will continue to see bearing fruit. The effort is an element of the same goal that the Boston bombers themselves had. Why did they want to kill people at the Boston Marathon? Just to kill people? Were they just psychopaths? Obviously not. At this point, quite a lot has come out about who they were and what they were all about. They were Islamic jihadis. What is the Islamic jihad? The Quran mandates that Muslims must wage war against non-Muslims in order to bring them under the rule of Islamic law. That's what the mayhem is for. It is to terrorize us in accord with the Quran, chapter 8, verse 60, which says that Muslims must strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah. But the terror is not just undifferentiated fear. It's for a goal. And the goal is that Islamic law will reign over the whole world. The goal is ultimately to weaken our society, and consider the hundreds of billions that we have spent since 9/11 on security, on trying to fight this, on so many measures to try to prevent this from happening again. Increasingly wrong-headed and misdirected, but nonetheless, they have crippled the U.S. economy by means of this terror attack on September 11th, 2001, and that's what they wanted to do. That's what they were trying to do. And the ultimate goal is to destroy the United States government altogether and replace it with an Islamic government. The chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran says, "Fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book." That's us. Mostly, people of the book are primarily Jews and Christians, and that's mostly what you have in the United States. Until they pay the jizya, which is a tax that is levied on the non-Muslims who are subject to the Muslims in the Islamic State, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, what does that mean? I happen to have the Quran with me tonight, and this is a Quran that I got actually in the Finsbury Park Mosque. The Finsbury Park Mosque is in London. And I was over there, and I went on a tour of mosques, and went in, and they were very friendly in all of them. And this one, they loaded me down with books. The Finsbury Park Mosque was famous a few years back because it was the mosque of Abu Hamza al-Masri, Captain Hook, who has 2 hooks for his hands because he is he's a very pious man, and he lost his hands in a bomb accident, the bomb that he was preparing in the cause of jihad, as well as an eye. And Abu Hamza al-Masri is now in prison. Actually, he's been extradited to the United States for plotting jihad activities over here. And I went into this mosque, and I said, "Didn't you have a little trouble a few years back?" And they said, "Oh yes, we did, but now it's all gone. Those people are gone, and we're all moderates." And they gave me this Quran. And this Quran is very helpful because it's got commentary on, it doesn't just have the Quranic text, which can be very confusing and hard to understand, but it's got commentary by one of the leading Islamic scholars of the 20th century, Maulana Maududi, Sayyid Abu Allah Maududi, who was a Pakistani jihad theorist, the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still the largest Islamic supremacist pro-Sharia party in Pakistan. And Maududi also wrote a commentary on the Quran. He was very well respected. You go into your local Islamic bookstore, you'll find books by Maududi. And so I got this moderate Quran, and it's got a comment on that verse. And it says, the purpose, the verse that says, "Fight the people of the book until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued," until the non-Muslims, in other words, submit to the rule of the Muslim. And he says, the purpose for which Muslims are required to fight is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. And you always hear that. Islam is not about forced conversions. Okay, great. But what is it for? Rather, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty, the rule of the unbelievers, so that the latter are unable to rule over people.
the authority to rule should only be vested in those who follow the true faith. Unbelievers who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination. Did you get that? That the authority to rule should only be vested in those who follow the true faith, that is Islam. In other words, non-Muslims, as Maududi himself put it in another place, non-Muslims have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth. And if they do, the Muslims have the obligation to dislodge them from that power by any means possible. Now, the Boston bombings were for that goal. That's what they were ultimately for. That's why it was done. It was part of the attempt to weaken the United States so that the United States ultimately falls. But there is another aspect to this war. It is not just about blowing things up and killing people. The other aspect to this war is to render us unable to speak about it, and thus paralyzed in our ability to resist it. And that is for the same goal of ultimately destroying the free country in which we are still living, sort of, and replacing it with an Islamic state. The Muslim Brotherhood is, of course, as you know, in power in Egypt now, but it's not just an Egyptian entity. All of the major Muslim organizations in the United States are tied to the Brotherhood. They're Brotherhood groups. And the Brotherhood, according to a captured internal document that was released a few years back, is dedicated, in its own words, in the United States to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house so that it falls and Allah's religion is victorious over other religions. Now that's why the bombers bombed, but this is also why the Muslim groups pressured the FBI and the other agencies to scrub all the training materials of any mention of Islam. In the first place, Islamic law forbids criticism of Islam on pain of death. And so by scrubbing the training materials, the United States government was already acquiescing to an element of Islamic law, which is the goal. That's the whole point, to get us to accept Islamic law. And so they've already got one foot in the door. But also, obviously, if we can't talk about this, then we can't formulate ways to counter it effectively. And we saw the bitter fruit of that in Boston. These FBI agents, I read that there was a cell, a sleeper cell, that these guys were connected to. I only heard that reported once in the Daily Mirror, which is a British newspaper. And the Daily Mirror said that they had information that there was a 12-man sleeper cell that the Tsarnaev brothers were part of. And that 1,000 FBI agents were on the street now looking for these 12 guys. And I thought, get 10,000, get 100,000, get all the FBI agents in the land. It doesn't matter, because they don't know what to look for, and they don't know how to understand it when they find it. And so, the problem that we face is much larger than most people have any idea. Because not only is this happening in the government, but it's also happening in the media. Have you ever noticed? You could have noticed this past week, if you haven't ever noticed before, but it is an ongoing pattern that happens every time there is a jihad terror attack or jihad terror. Have you ever noticed that the newspapers have been full this past week with stories about mosques asking police for extra security and bracing for a backlash? Because we all know that Americans are so out of control and so crazy that innocent Muslims constantly get victimized. Well, of course, none of that really ever happens. There's never been a backlash. Of course, there are a few people who say rude things to people, or there have even been some cases of people being violent toward Muslims when there was no other reason apparent but that they were mad about jihad terror. However, the Council on American-Islamic Relations is so desperate to find these instances of backlash that they have an annual report about hate crimes against Muslims, and it includes fake hate crimes.
It includes Muslim store owners burning down their own store and collecting the insurance money. And they never correct the report when this kind of thing comes out. And there have been many instances of these faked hate crimes. And why is it? Because hate crimes for the Muslim groups in the United States, which are Muslim Brotherhood groups, are a big business. Why? Why are there so many stories about backlash, and why does the Muslim community want hate crimes against themselves? It's all part of the same thing. That if we are not aware of this threat, then we will not fight against it. And what they try to do, and have done very successfully, is turn the attention of the mainstream media away from the reality of the jihad threat and onto the idea of Muslims as victims. And the Muslims as victims stories always fill the papers after a jihad terror plot or attack. And yet, hate crimes against Jews are actually 8 times more common in the United States than hate crimes against Muslims. But how many times have you seen in the mainstream media a consideration of what to do to combat anti-Semitism in the United States? Versus how many times have you seen in the mainstream media stories about what we can do about the rising tide of Islamophobia? It's very clear that this is a coordinated propaganda campaign, and that it is very skillfully designed in order to make good people, decent American people who love their country, intimidated into thinking that there's something wrong with resisting jihad and talking honestly about the jihad threat. I just quoted the Quran a little while ago, right? And in doing that, I explained that the Boston bombers were trying to do something that is taught in the Quran, the holy book of Islam, and is sanctioned by the Islamic faith. We don't have the time, but there is a mountain of other evidence from the Islamic sources that establish that. But think about what the US government signed onto and what the Muslim groups were asking them to sign onto when they got the training materials scrubbed. They were asking them to accept the idea that to look into the motives and goals of jihad terrorists, which is what all the training materials were about, is racist, bigoted, and hateful and Islamophobic. And when I talk about it, they say the same thing about me. When anybody else talks about it, they say the same thing about them. And the newspapers never discuss these aspects of Islam or the motives of the bombers. What there has been is a ludicrous hunt over the last week for the motives of the bombers. Even after Jokhar Tsarnaev said, "We did it to defend Islam." Salon magazine ran a piece, "Why are terrorists so often men?" Yeah, that's it. Well, why are saxophonists so often men? Why are garbage collectors so often men? It's totally irrelevant to the question. They didn't do it because they were male. They did it because they were Muslims. And yet, when this is discussed openly and honestly, it is considered hate speech. It is considered some kind of an offense against decency, and something that the American Muslim advocacy groups, with the willing help of the mainstream media, are doing their best to rule out of the public discourse and to render unacceptable to discuss. So I applaud you for having me here, and of course this is an Acts chapter and you're already well aware of a lot of these things and the dimensions of the threat. But you should understand that, it was mentioned earlier that I was canceled by a Catholic men's conference last month in Worcester, Massachusetts. You have to understand that these kinds of things are exactly the same struggle. It's just another front in the same battle. What they're trying to do systematically is demonize and marginalize and thereby render ineffective anybody and everybody who speaks out about these things. And so I got the invitation to speak at this conference, and as soon as the Boston Globe found out about it, and as soon as the Muslim advocacy groups found out about it, they protested. And the Bishop of Worcester immediately caved in. Noni Darwish was supposed to speak at Columbia University and at Princeton. Same thing happened. Muslim groups complained, she got canceled. Pamela Geller was supposed to speak at a synagogue on Long Island. Same thing happened, she got canceled. This happens over and over again all over the country. And the thing is that these groups that bring people like us in, they do not realize what's going on. They do not realize what is happening. And they think, well, you know, we just wanted to have an event about the threat, and this guy is way too controversial, and so we'll just have to get somebody else. What they're trying to do is render the truth so controversial that we will back away from it. And that we will accept the big lie, and it's no less of a big lie than the one that Joseph Goebbels put across on the Germans. We will accept the big lie with alacrity and not do anything about it. And nobody will be left to speak out about it. And so you see, it's all tied together. That there is an effort on the one hand to shut up the government, and they got them. Because Barack Obama was absolutely willing to do this, eager to do their bidding. And they got the media to be quiet. Now the media, mostly, as we have heard many times, survey after survey shows that most media people are on the far left, politically. And, you know, the far left, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, is increasingly anti-American, increasingly at odds with any attempt to defend the United States or to defend the principles on which this country is based. And so they see this other rapidly anti-American group, the Islamic jihadis, and of course they're also non-white, non-Christian, non-Western. They can do no wrong. And they see everything in racial terms on the left. They're the real racists who see everything as a racial issue, and they see, well, the United States is mostly white, and these Muslims, they're mostly brown. The Muslims must be right, and they have some legitimate grievance. Actually, this is not a racial issue at all. This is an issue of an authoritarian and supremacist ideology that will deny us basic rights and is in contradiction to the Constitution and to the freedoms that we are guaranteed by the Constitution in numerous particulars. And that brings us, of course, to the First Amendment. These are all free speech issues. And the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 57 Muslim governments around the world, 56 nations, and the Palestinian Authority, is the largest voting bloc in the UN since the demise of the Soviet bloc. And they have for years been pursuing attempts to compel the West to criminalize criticism of Islam, and to get the United States to actually outlaw speaking about Islam in ways that they do not like. Now this might seem absurd, and in the early 2000s, the Bush administration resisted this and rejected it at the UN every year when they would try to bring these resolutions. The Obama administration signed on. Resolution 1618 of the United Nations Human Rights Council calls on member states to criminalize what they call incitement to religious hatred or defamation of religions. Now, I just quoted the Quran and quoted the commentary by a leading Muslim scholar who's internationally renowned and respected. Was that incitement to religious hatred? It's in their book. If there's religious hatred, they said it. That stuff about the non-Muslims have no right to rule and have to be in submission to the Muslims, I think that's their hate speech. I'm saying you should resist that in the name of freedom and equality of rights for all people before the law. But you see, incitement to religious hatred, that's what they would call that. They think I just did some of that by saying that there are Muslims who believe that and are acting upon it and are working on it in the United States right now, which is a rather obvious fact. And so, the Obama administration signed on. Now,
a lot of times I talk about these things. I don't know if you're raising your hand to ask me a question, but I will have questions at the end. So give me a little while and I'll get to you. The Obama administration had to recognize that the United States has this pesky thing, the First Amendment, that guarantees the freedom of speech. And the Founding Fathers were extraordinarily wise to put that into the Bill of Rights because freedom of speech is the fundamental safeguard against tyranny. There is nothing else between us and a dictatorial government that can do whatever it wants. If we can speak out against it, though, then we can rally opposition. But if we can't speak out against it, then forget it. They can run roughshod. And so, the Obama administration had to recognize that we have this, and that they were essentially going on record. The United States government was going on record at the United Nations against the United States Constitution. And they said that we understand that there are countries that have these freedom of speech clauses, and so we ask them to work to find other strategies in order to safeguard the idea that there's no incitement to religious hatred. And Hillary Clinton was asked about this after she signed on to this resolution, and she said, yeah, I think that we should subject the people who incite to religious hatred to a good old-fashioned public shaming. And when I read that, I thought, what are you going to do, put me in the stocks? What is this, Plymouth? The thing is, I realize now what she meant. What she meant was the people in the mainstream media who carry out this agenda would assist and abet the demonization of anybody who speaks the truth about Islam and jihad. And that's what we see happening. And remember also, after the Benghazi massacre, which was a jihad massacre, the Obama administration immediately blamed a YouTube video of Muhammad's life that nobody had ever seen. And Muslims duly started rioting and killing in other countries about this Muhammad video. But it's now come out that nobody in Libya was upset about this Muhammad video. Nobody had heard of it, and they were rioting for some other reason. Why would the Obama administration immediately invoke this video? And everybody did. Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, Jay Carney. They all said, oh, it's this video, it's this video, it's this video. Well, think about the implications of that, my friends. Think about that for a minute. What he was saying was, our free speech is at fault. If we would just shut up about Muhammad, then these things wouldn't happen. And so that's the last thing I'm going to do. I'm going to keep talking about Muhammad until I'm dead. Which may be soon, since I keep talking about Muhammad. Fact is, the picture of the Prophet of Islam that you get from the Muslim texts is of a violent individual who had his enemies assassinated and who taught his followers to make war against people gratuitously because they had different beliefs, and to essentially enslave them and take their money and destroy their communities. He has the excellent example of conduct in the supreme guide that Muslims must emulate, also, of course, consummated a marriage with a 9-year-old girl when he was 54, and so we see child marriage rather common in places like Iran and Afghanistan. This man is no kind of example, and he is the cause of numerous human rights violations and untold human suffering. And if we're not able to talk about that, that suffering is going to continue. So, who is the only person who is in jail right now for the Benghazi jihad massacre? The filmmaker who made that Muhammad video. He was, right after the Benghazi attacks, arrested on a parole violation. Now, I don't know this man. I have been accused of being involved in making this film. This is all part of the defamation that is regularly given to those who speak out about Islam and jihad.
Actually, I don't know this guy, I never met him, and I had nothing to do with this video, and I actually haven't even seen it to this day. So I don't know what's in it, I don't care, because I will, like Voltaire said, I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So anyway, apparently he's a shady character, and he has an arrest record, and he was out on parole or probation. And one of the conditions of the probation was that he not go on the internet. And so they got him on that because they figured you must have uploaded this video to YouTube, which means you went on the internet, back in jail. Now I ask you, do you think that there are any violators of parole or probation out on the streets today? Do you think that any of them are guilty of more serious crimes than going on the internet? Do you think that anybody in the US government is worried about rounding them up and clapping them in prison? No, of course not. That man, and I don't even know his real name, he went by several names, but whoever he is, he's a political prisoner in the United States right now. And he is a hostage to the Obama administration's war against the freedom of speech and abetting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Muslim advocacy groups in the United States' war on free speech and attempt to silence us about the jihad threat. Not only that, but the father of one of the men who was killed in Benghazi says that Hillary Clinton said to him at a White House meeting of the families of the victims, "We're going to have that filmmaker arrested and jailed." And she did. And so, in the United States, at least up to now, critics of jihad and Islamic supremacism, and those who dare to speak publicly about how it is in contradiction to constitutional freedoms and has to be resisted if we're going to survive as a free people, so far, we are not being actively targeted for assassination. The assassination is of a different kind. It's character assassination. And the same thing that happened to the filmmaker is the same thing that is going to happen to all the rest of us, and the same thing that is going to happen to all of us in this room if this continues as it is going now. There are already hate crimes laws on the books in the United States. You know, if I come to you and pull a gun and take your money, then that's a crime. But if I come to you and pull a gun and take your money and call you a nasty name, that's a hate crime. Now, it's exactly the same crime, but if I call you a nasty name, then the penalties are worse, especially if it's racially tinged. So, that's a hate speech law already. We already have hate speech laws in the United States. Now, so far, the implications of that have not been drawn out, but they will be. And they will be drawn out like this, that people who dare to quote the Quran, who dare to quote the Islamic authorities, who dare to quote the Muslim Brotherhood's agenda in the United States, who dare to speak honestly about what Muhammad was and what he said and did according to the Islamic traditions, they will be charged with hate. We're already being charged with hate all the time in the mainstream media, but the apparatus is already being put into place to make this into statute, into law. And what will happen if we are all gone from the scene and silenced? If we're all in prison like the poor filmmaker, or if we are all fined until we can't do anything else and, you know, and I'm tending bar somewhere or something, what's going to happen? The same thing that happened in Boston, only on a much larger scale. You're going to see attacks like that every other week. Because it will be that much worse than it is now. Right now, we're still able to have this meeting. Right now, this is being filmed and it's going to go up on YouTube. Right now, I can still write books. Geller still writes books. We have the website. I have Jihad Watch and she's got Atlas Shrugs. And there are other websites and publications and other people who are fighting for freedom and are out there speaking about these issues truly and honestly. Right now there are. But if we're all gone, then we're going to see a situation that is like what we saw in Boston, 10 times squared. We're going to see not only the FBI not knowing what to look for and not knowing how to understand what they see when they do see it, but we're going to see nobody out there who is equipped to deal with this or to explain it or to help people understand it. And then what's left? Then it's just a matter of the dotting the I's and crossing the T's and making this into an Islamic State. There'll be nobody to resist. Nobody will be able to speak out.
Like Pastor Niemöller.
Yes, precisely like Pastor Niemöller. There was a young man in the Fort Dix area. You remember the Fort Dix 6? Fort Dix was the site of the jihad plot a few years back, but it was foiled. And that's why some of you might not have heard about it, because of course the foiled plots are very important, but they don't make news like Boston does. Now, the Fort Dix plot was foiled. A group of Muslims was going to go into Fort Dix and kill as many American soldiers as possible before getting killed themselves so they would go and get the virgins. Which is in chapter 9, verse 111 of the Quran. Paradise is guaranteed to those who kill and are killed for Allah. Allah said it. Anyway, the Fort Dix 6, they liked to watch jihad videos. They liked to watch, like the beheading of Daniel Pearl, gruesome, bloody stuff like that. They loved it because that's how they were. They thought it was pleasing to Allah. But they had them on VHS tapes. So they took them to a video store, and they asked the kid, this teenager, behind the counter, if he would convert them to DVD. And so he was working to convert them to DVD, and he sees all this horrible stuff going by. And so he went to the manager. Now, I got to give this kid credit. I don't even know his name, but he foiled the plot. And we all owe him a debt of gratitude. But he almost didn't. Because when he went to the manager, he said, I saw these horrible, bloody things, and I think these guys are up to no good. Should I call the police, or would that be racist? Now, we laugh and it's funny, but think about it for a minute. Why did he even think? Why did he even hesitate? Why did it even occur to him that it might be racist to uncover this plot and to go to the police? Because of the number they've already done on us in regard to any truthful speech about this matter. If you talk about it, you're racist. I'll bet all of you in here have friends or relatives who've called you racist or bigoted because you have told the truth about the jihad threat. And this shows the effectiveness of this campaign. And so, the Second Amendment is under grave threat. The First Amendment is under grave threat. All it takes is 5 justices, to a test case and 5 justices to say, yes, hate speech is not free speech and enjoys no protections under the First Amendment. And that could happen very easily. Sotomayor and Kagan, the 2 Obama appointees on the Supreme Court, are already on record saying there should be restrictions on the freedom of speech. And so, in conclusion, I have to emphasize to you that this all is disturbing, I understand, but I am not being alarmist. And I am not being hysterical. These things are happening now, and they're happening quickly. I don't think it's too late. I was born in South Carolina, and the state motto of South Carolina is Dum Spiro Spero. While I breathe, I hope. And so there is always hope as long as there's another breath. But the situation is very dire, and it is very important for all of us, every one of us in this room, to understand that we have to fight this battle wherever we are, in whatever situation, and whoever we're with, whatever our talents are, whatever our time is, whatever our resources are, we have to fight this. Nobody else is going to do it for us. The government is not going to do it. Law enforcement is not going to do it. We have already seen, we're just beginning to see, the incredible consequences that are certain to come from their denial and obfuscation of the Islamic Jihad. It's only going to get worse. So, it is up to us as free citizens to put pressure, to stand up, and to make as loud a noise about this as possible, to put pressure on the media to tell the truth about this,
to put pressure on our governing officials to make this an issue. I still believe that freedom can prevail. And if every one of us begins to act, then it certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're very kind. I have we have some time for some questions, right?
Yes.
So, yes, sir.
Just kind of a general question with regard to law enforcement and police. With regard to Second Amendment, we've been given the line that the police actually favor gun control. When I know personally, I've seen all kinds of surveys, that's not true by any means. In fact, they support us. On the jihadi side, is that the same situation where we're both fitted into thinking that the police want to ignore it, but in fact they know what the deal is and what's going on?
Yes. The question is, in regard to the Second Amendment, we're told that the police favor gun control, but the gentleman knows personally many who obviously do not. And is it the same situation with the First Amendment? Is that the correct summation? Okay. There's a great struggle going on in all the intelligence and law enforcement agencies. When I was speaking to them in years past, it was already going on then. The high-ups were political appointees who were politically correct and compromised. But the mid-level agents and the mid-level officers mostly were on board. They knew the truth and they were fighting a good fight. Now that's changing, because you can imagine the extraordinary pressures that they're being put under. And when Brennan said, we're not only going to remove all these materials, but we're going to re-educate everybody who was trained by them, you can see the kinds of pressures that they're under. Nonetheless, the great Steve Emerson of the Investigative Project, who was on this issue long before most of us, he said just the other day that he's still in contact sub rosa, on the QT, with a lot of people in government and law enforcement who want to get the truth and are working for the truth. And so this is one of the other reasons why there's still hope. It's not just so easy as to say, if we get a new president who has some sense, then everything will be okay. Because I was dismayed, to tell you the truth, at the third debate between Obama and Romney, the foreign policy debate, when Obama is saying, we've got to aid the Syrian rebels who were Al-Qaeda jihadis, you know, and Romney says, oh yes we do. And everything was me too, me too, me too, instead of articulating a genuine opposition. We don't really have an opposition in regard to the jihad threat right now. The Republicans are completely compromised. You can't run as a major Republican candidate without the endorsement of Grover Norquist of Americans for Tax Reform, who's an extraordinarily influential power player in Washington. And Grover Norquist is in like this with the Muslim Brotherhood. There are canceled checks that you can find online from Abdurrahman al-Amoudi to Norquist. Abdurrahman al-Amoudi was the leading moderate Muslim in the United States in the 90s. He was the head of the American Muslim Council, and he was another big power broker in the Washington establishment. There are pictures of him with Clinton, pictures of him with G.W. Bush, and he was tight with Norquist. And he's now in prison for financing Al-Qaeda. There's video of him on the mall in Washington in the year 2000 saying, hear this, Bill Clinton, we are all supporters of Hamas. We are all supporters of Hezbollah. Well, those are registered as terrorist organizations, listed as terrorist organizations by the State Department. And Grover Norquist is taking money from this guy. And you can't get anywhere in the Republican Party without Grover. And so the Republican Party has not been anywhere on this issue. Unless there is a change in that, and that whole establishment is cleared out, and a new opposition arises, this is not going to change even if a conservative Republican is elected in 2016, which is unlikely anyway. Yes, sir.
I
wonder if I could ask you to expand a little bit on any advice you might have for us on disrupting the alliance between the secular left and militant Islam. That seems to me to be the key. And as someone who is very involved in the fight against same-sex marriage in Connecticut, I'm struck by the references to intimidation, to character assassination, the brainwashing of the young, the lameness of the Republican Party, all the things that we fought the homosexual movement on, very similar to what you're describing. Of course, they're not trying to kill us the way the militant Islams are, but I'm struck by the coincidences, and it seems to me that the key to winning is disrupting that alliance. How do we explain to the secular left that Islam is not their friend?
How do we explain to the secular left that Islam is not their friend? It's very hard because Islam is their friend. The thing is, it seems like an improbable alliance, but it's actually a true marriage of minds. They are both authoritarian. They're both enemies of free speech. They're both supremacist. The left has Saul Alinsky, who recommends that you not debate with the opposition. You just ridicule the opposition, demonize and marginalize the opposition until the opposition falls away. That's just what the Islamic supremacists do. They both envision, and I'm talking about the hard left now, but I'm not sure that there's so much of a difference anymore, but the communists, whenever they gained power, instituted a reign of terror in service of establishing the earthly utopia where the state would wither away and everybody would be equal. Now, that's an authoritarian vision. Sharia also envisions a perfect society in which there is justice and peace prevailing in the land, and anybody who gets out of line has their head chopped off, or their hand chopped off, or whatever. And so I think they're both violent totalitarians at heart. And also, the Muslims want the gay marriage because they want to destroy the idea that marriage is between one man and one woman. Because once they have marriage between one man and one woman out of the way, then they can have polygamy. And they were already, Ibrahim Hooper of the Council of American Islamic Relations admitted a few years back that there are thousands of Muslims in the United States who are already in polygamous unions. And he said, Islamic scholars disagree over whether that's permissible in the United States. And I read that and I thought, what? Who cares what Islamic scholars agree or disagree on? It's against the law. In the United States, he didn't say a word about that. He didn't care, of course. But I don't think they're going to make any headway. I mean, of course, you can embarrass them. You can press the contradictions. And I do this often. Just recently, as a matter of fact, Pamela Geller, who I work with, did a series of ads on buses in San Francisco. And they were calling attention to the reality of jihad terror, because the Hamas-linked Council on American Islamic Relations was running ads saying jihad is getting your kids to school and blowing milk bubbles through your straw and, you know, romping through the daisies. And so it's a disinformation campaign. So she put up these ads that have actual quotes from jihadis. And then the whole San Francisco City Council apparatus condemned our ads, which they've never bothered to do for any other ads, including viciously anti-Semitic, anti-Israel ads that ran on buses before. So she got an idea for a new series of ads that showed Muslim leaders saying homosexuals should be stoned to death and so on, because there was this transgender who was saying these ads were so terrible. And so we thought we'd press the contradictions a bit. And over the years, I have written many articles that you can find linked to Jihad Watch about Western feminists defending the oppression of Muslim women.
What?
Oh yeah. Many Western feminists saying that, well, you know, this is their culture and they're happy in it, and we see that they choose this many times, and so it's wonderful. I'm not saying anything about that wife-beating is sanctioned in the Quran, or that polygamy is essentially the commodification of women combined with the easy divorce. I'm not saying anything about the sex slavery, which is sanctioned in Islam. A lot of people don't know that, but in chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran, it says that a man can have up to 4 wives, and that's at one time. You can just divorce them and get new ones, just like that. Just say, talaq, you're divorced. But you also can have the captives your right hands possess. Now the captives your right hands possess, those are infidel women who had been captured in battle. Now, this is the Quran, and you might say, well, you're finding these terrible things in the Quran that nobody really pays attention to, and you know there are bad things in the Bible, too. Okay, but over the last couple of years, there have been 3 authorities, one in Kuwait, one in Egypt, and one in Saudi Arabia, saying, yeah, the Quran says Muslim men should have sex slaves. And the lady in Kuwait, it was a lady, a female legislator in Kuwait, saying that the Muslim jihadis, they should capture infidel women in Chechnya, which is incidentally where the Tsarnaevs are from, and press them into service for this as sex slaves for the Muslim men. And so this is not a dead letter. These people are on television saying this ought to be done in Muslim countries today. And so, in any case, the contradictions can be shown up. But I've written quite a few articles about feminists running interference for the Muslim oppression of women. And usually they just say, oh, no, 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 I talk about that all the time. Okay, where? And then they clam up, because they don't. Yeah, you were waiting